So I'm like, yeah, no, I don't have any points, but thank you for all that. So,
What is points?
so you can have, if you have a meal plan, you get like points, so you can use them in other. So like, I'm not gonna get lunch over at the cafeteria. I'm gonna buy something there. So you can do it that way. So, okay. All right, so do you guys remember that we store carbohydrates in the liver and we store carbohydrates in the muscle? Right? We're storing glucose in those places. We store it as glycogen. And so the primary role of glycogen that's in the liver is to maintain and match blood glucose levels, so that stays constant over time. Muscle glycogen really exists just to provide carbohydrate energy for muscles when they're contracting, so they don't have to use glucose from the blood. Okay, you're always going to bring some in because of contraction-mediated GLUT4 translocation and those things. But if we can break down muscle glycogen, then we can get some energy quickly. We don't have to lower our blood glucose level. Dropping blood glucose levels can cause fatigue, but also so can falling levels of muscle glycogen cause fatigue. That will become important when we talk about fat. All right. So let's talk about then how we're going to break that glycogen down. So remember, that process of breaking down is called glycogenolysis. Right? I don't really know where the geno in there always confuses me. It should just be glycolysis, but we'll live to fight another day. The primary thing that affects this is going to be exercise intensity. Okay, and that should make sense to you guys, right? When I do higher intensity exercise, that is going to be a more carbohydrate driven, more immediate energy kind of thing, because it gives me the option of going through glycolysis and making lactic acid, or going through glycolysis and going into the Krebs cycle. I can use both. Okay. So if you look at this, there seems to be an exponential kind of positively accelerating increase as intensity goes up. And we'll talk about the whys of all of that as we get into the enzymes that control this and regulate that a little bit. With duration, as you go longer and longer, muscle glycogen use or muscle glycogen breakdown is going to fall. So you tend to break down muscle glycogen to a much greater extent at the start of exercise than you do later on. And again, that's driven by a shift to using fat, okay? That will become a little bit more clear kind of when we get to the very end today. Or maybe I'm hoping we'll get to it today. Your preceding diet and your training status also matter, okay? If you've eaten a bunch of carbs, two things will happen. One, you have a higher level of blood glucose, so you can use some blood glucose and maybe not use as much of your muscle glycogen. Also, if you've eaten a bunch of carbs beforehand, you probably have higher levels of muscle glycogen. And so in that instance, then you've got more to be able to use there. If you've eaten a bunch of fat or something beforehand, that's going to also play some things. The preceding diet and your training status really matter when intensity is sort of moderate to kind of moderately high, and the duration is a little bit longer. Okay, it doesn't really matter what you've eaten if you're going to go do sprints, right? You're going to use your muscle glycogen. You're just doing some sprints. You're not going to do enough to deplete all of it or anything else. And so there that goes. If you're doing high intensity stuff, if you're super trained or super untrained, it's not going to have a big influence. These things really matter when you're doing kind of longer duration, more moderate intensity exercise, because it's going to drive our balance between carbs and the carb location and fat. Okay, and so preceding diet and training status may help shift us from glycogen towards fat. Okay, so I'll say this now. You guys can put a little star by this in your notes. We're not going to talk about this until I come back to it towards the end of class. But one of the big things we need to concern ourselves with metabolism is fatigue. Okay, is fatigue. I cannot supply a sufficient amount of energy. Therefore, I must stop or slow down or reduce the force of my muscle contraction. Okay. Glycogen levels when they fall in the muscle, can result in fatigue. Blood glucose levels, if they fall too low, will cause fatigue. Okay? Both of those things can happen. And so if we can get to a place where we don't use blood glucose and we hang on to some of our muscle glycogen, then you can go longer at whatever intensity you're doing and you can be okay. Right? Those 2 points are really going to be important as we kind of get on to what determines endurance exercise performance. Okay? And it doesn't matter, you're going to lift weights today, like who cares? You're not going to be in a place where you can complete things. That's not going to be a really, really big deal. Okay. For muscle glycogen, there's going to be several things that are going to regulate. Like you're sitting here, you're not stimulating glycogenolysis as much as you would if we are actively doing high intensity contractions. Okay. So things that regulate its breakdown, this is muscle specific, okay, are calcium, inorganic phosphate, ADP, AMP, IMP, and the level of glycogen. These first ones, especially these first 3, ought to look familiar, right? This is one of the things that regulates basically everything in metabolism. Calcium goes up, inorganic phosphate goes up, ADP goes up. All of this indicates, right, lots of muscle contractions, lots of energy turnover. So we better ramp up our processes, ramp up our speeds, and begin to break down and provide substrate for those sped up reactions. There is a level of hormonal regulation, and it's done through beta-adrenergic receptors. It's done via epinephrine. So if I bathe your muscles in epinephrine, they bind to these beta-adrenergic receptors, and voila, that's going to stimulate the breakdown of muscle glycogen. When you do high-intensity exercise, guess what goes up? Epinephrine. Guess what goes up reasonably in proportion to exercise intensity? Epinephrine. Okay. So this is going to be one of the things that's going to drive it. It's going to function here a little bit differently than kind of some fat metabolism and other things that are going to be driven by all of this. Okay. So substrate availability. So glycogen is broken down by glycogen phosphorylase. All right, that's the enzyme that's going to drive this reaction. And so the binding of these 2 things are going to be driven by this activity. Blood glucose availability has little influence on what's going on here. So even as blood glucose levels begin to fall, or even if we make them go way, way up, it doesn't have a huge influence on glycogen phosphorylase. It's more of these other 2 kinds of things. They're going to kind of work from adjacent pathways. Okay. Reduced free fatty acid availability, however, okay, which may be the result of having very high blood glucose levels because you just ate a bag of Skittles or something, okay, that is going to enhance glycogen breakdown. So these 2 things may interact because a lot of times what happens is you eat something that's high sugar and low fat, and even though blood glucose levels have gone up, you may have low free fatty acid, and so therefore you're actually going to start breaking down more glycogen. So it's kind of weird interactions. So here's kind of what we've got. So here we've got blood, we've got epinephrine in the blood. Here's our muscle cell, right? Epinephrine binds to the beta-adrenergic receptor. We're not going to get into, no, I love a good signaling pathway. It signals through cyclic AMP, right? We're going to activate one of our protein kinases, which are inhibited at rest, blah, 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 blah. We're going to have phosphorylate kinase that gets turned on. The end action of all of this basically is that we activate this phosphorylase B enzyme down here, and that tells glycogen to be broken down into glucose. And now here we go, we're going to have glucose. Okay, so what you see here, this can be a muscle cell. It can also be sort of a liver and a kidney. If it's there, if it's in the muscle, then the glucose stays as glucose 6-phosphate stays, and we use it. Or if it's in the liver, then it can get released back out into the blood to try to replace blood glucose levels. Okay, so if we zoom in kind of down here on this glycogen phosphorylase B, it exists as an inactive enzyme under kind of resting situations. So it's not on at its highest rate all the time. And so here you're going to have, it has binding sites for AMP. It has binding sites for calcium. Okay. And both of those kinds of things, when we get an increase in calcium, then that's going to lead to an increase in the activity of this phosphorylase kinase. It's going to inhibit this phosphorylase phosphatase, and then that's going to end up with phosphorylation going on down here, and it turns us from our inhibited into our active version of what's happening. Okay. The important thing is this is just some of the cellular kind of regulation by these metabolic products, okay, that are going to activate this enzyme and lead to greater breakdown of muscle glycogen. So you can imagine a scenario whereby I have this enzyme, it's inactive at rest in my muscle cell. We start doing some sprinting exercise. I get epinephrine release. That does some of this. I'm getting ATP from lots of ATP turnover. I'm getting calcium from lots of contractions. And so the combined effects of all of this is a much, much greater activation of phosphorylase, the glycogen phosphorylase, and therefore I'm going to sort of dump a huge amount of glucose into either the bloodstream or into my muscle cell, so now it can use it if it needs to. In a lot of instances, if you go do some sprints, this goes way up, you don't actually metabolize and use all of it, it just gets shoved back into glycogen again when you stop exercising. Okay. If you exercise long enough, you can deplete completely all of your muscle glycogen. Okay. Usually at kind of moderate intensities of exercise, think 60, 70% of VO2 max, it may take 90 minutes to 2 hours to do all of that. Okay. So if you play a soccer match, you're probably right on the edge of that happening. If you run a half marathon, if you go really slow, you may be kind of right there. If you go pretty fast, no, maybe not so much. You run a full marathon, you're absolutely going to be there, right? I know Boston was today, which is the weirdest thing in the world. It's supposed to be like in March, supposed to be on Patriots Day. Not March, God, it's supposed to be in April. In my case, it's usually like the end of the first week of the baseball season. But it was today. I promise you, those people running the Boston Marathon, they've depleted their muscle glycogen. Okay. Anybody ever run that for? Run like 18, 19 miles? Jordan, you're the only one. Okay. You guys had, remember you told me that day that they gave me this gel pack and I ate these gummy bears and I magically felt better. What happened was you did a bunch of this, you broke down all of your muscle glycogen, and even though you had an adequate amount of blood glucose, your brain becomes very unhappy. You eat the gummy bears, your blood glucose level goes up. Voila, you magically feel better. Keep running.
I would never recommend anyone to run. There you go.
Okay, don't do it again.
Never again.
Okay, so Ethan, your question, and then I know Matt, you had a question.
I didn't clarify. I was asking about the gel shots. Are they getting them to the runners or to the other people's?
Yes, both. They were available for consumption if a person wanted them. So, and the ones that like we were giving, they had leaded and unleaded versions of them available upon request, because my daughter had one. My neighbor, they have a 5-year-old, he had one. They did not have any alcohol. There was just a tiny amount of alcohol in them. So the idea is, right, there's Jell-O, there's some sugar in there, there is some glucose, and so it can help to improve your blood glucose situation through some complex mechanisms that we'll talk about at the very, very end of class that may actually enhance performance. So there's a reason Gatorade works in the same way that the gummy bears or a Jell-O, like eating some Jell-O, anything that has carbs in it will work in those kinds of things. Gatorade is pointless unless you're going to be in a situation where you either had, like you have very low blood glucose levels anyway, or if you're not going to deplete your muscle glycogen, then it's not of any better use to you than water. Although if you're like me and water tastes terrible, and I'm pretty sure there's like meth and crack in blue Powerade, and I'm like, give me all the blue Powerade. You will, it tastes better, so people will drink more, which is actually sometimes a positive thing. That's the idea. The other part of the Jello shot is, I guess if there was enough alcohol in it, then you might get a little bit of a buzz, and that might reduce your feelings and your sensations of pain and things. Although it also impair your motor performance. So there's this really fine line you have to walk on all of those kinds of things. More thesis ideas. Give people Jello shots in the lab. How many Jello shots do we need to get to a place? Y'all laugh. There's actual research that is done on like those things. On exercising while like mildly intoxicated. Pardon? Yeah, it absolutely works. It does. Yes. It's sort of again a U-shaped curve. A little is good, a lot is bad, or a little is not so great. A little more is good, a lot is also bad. So, all right, Matt will do your question, and then we'll go to Christine.
Also, can you test up that skeleton physics? Great for that.
Just like for anything?
For alcohol and exercise.
Oh, alcohol and exercise. Okay. Okay.
And then for the so in a like training plan for a endurance athlete, they would usually have a long run. Is that why they have a long run?
Yeah, so this is fun. I was talking about this with my undergraduate class today. So you all will get this later on in the semester. You run past 40 minutes, anything over 40 minutes, you get no further adaptations in like VO2max and things. Yet if you want to run a half marathon or a marathon and you've never run more than 40 minutes, you're going to be in a world of hurt because you have no clue what it's like, what it feels like to be in that state with your glycogen depleted and everything. And so, yeah, that's why I would recommend, like physiologically, there are things that will happen that will cause what we call it central fatigue, where your brain is really pissed off at you about what's happening. So, yes.
Just one about like the feeling and like, muscular.
Yeah, like, yeah. Correct. Christina?
I was just gonna say, they have beer 5Ks.
Yes, I know.
It's actually really fun.
Okay.
Depending on which one you do. So do not recommend doing the one that you have to like chug a beer every like kilometer. That was not fun. But the one where like halfway through you drink the beer and then you kind of walk with the beer as you kind of finish the 5K.
That's called tailgating.
Yeah, but this one.
That's not exercise. That's not a race.
Well, okay, yeah. The one where you chug, that's not fun.
I'm not, no one is suggesting that it would be.
But it's like usually around Oktoberfest.
Okay.
Like, you get a sign and you just get to like the first half of it, you get to run, and then you get a sign and get to walk the rest of it.
Okay. Anybody wanting to run a beer 5K, Christina is your woman.
Yeah.
So.
I'll probably walk, but.
Okay. Questions? No? Okay. So here's a couple of kind of the really famous sort of graphs and some things as it relates to all of this. And what these things will hopefully illustrate, and I apologize that I don't have the reference for this. I'll tell you what this is and where it is. I want to make sure that we give attribution to all of this. So this is just kind of showing the rough contributions from muscle glycogen and from plasma glucose to your overall energy expenditure. In doing that, we can also see kind of where we're getting muscle, where we're getting things from. This is muscle triglycerides, and this is from plasma-free fatty acids. And so what you can see basically is this is intensity. This is increasing from rest to kind of a brisk walk, to a light jog, to a faster jog here. So this is intensity, and then these two are going to show the effects of what happens over, say, 2 hours at a constant intensity. This one here is mostly like a walk, and this one is kind of a more of a jog here. So these are some data from Luc Van Loon. They're almost 20 years old now. God, I can't believe that. What you can see is that muscle glycogen is this bar here. So you can see at rest, we're using practically no muscle glycogen. The white is free fatty acids from the plasma. So this is fat from your blood. The kind of more, kind of not really sky blue, but kind of, I don't know, it's not even really careless, kind of like Ole Miss blue, like their uniforms are today. I'm still very bitter about all of that. here, that's plasma glucose, and then this is going to be other fat sources. So this would be kind of intramuscular triglycerides that we can see. But this just illustrates that as intensity goes up, we're going to use more and more carbohydrates. You have to remember that our overall energy expenditure is also expanding. This is just kind of why the bars are getting bigger. But you can see how much kind of muscle glycogen we're using. So when you get up into here, it goes up. Weirdly, though, if it gets over about 80 or 85%, then we're going to start kind of dialing back on the free fatty acids and the other things. It's almost entirely kind of carbohydrate based. As we get closer and closer to max, it's almost all carbs. This one, and these are some data that came from Ed Coyle's lab at Texas. The first author on these, the guy's name is Glycogen, and I have forgotten what his first name is, but what they have done is try to show the contribution of glucose, like plasma glucose, muscle glycogen. So here you can see we've got carbs down here at the bottom, and then we've got fat up here on the top, and the contribution from muscle triglycerides, plasma free fatty acids. And then here we're walking, right? And so you've got plasma glucose, it's going to be here, and then plasma free fatty acids and muscle triglycerides. And so this is just illustrating that as intensity goes up, I'm going to use more carbs and less fat, right? When the intensity is very low, it's mostly the fat in that kind of way. I think this is kind of an overestimation in the midst of all of this. We can talk about the whys of that later. But the other part of this is note how as duration goes longer, plasma glucose is pretty constant. Muscle glycogen as a percentage of the whole is going to fall. And then plasma free fatty acids are going to go up. This is because we're using hormone sensitive lipase in adipose tissue, something lipase, right? And we're dumping from adipose tissue, we're dumping free fatty acids into the plasma. So when there's more of them in there, we're going to go ahead and use them. And then that lets us not use glycogen and we use some fat from inside of us, which is what we'll talk about. Just kind of just shows the interactions from these. I think these graphs are really, really cool. Not the least of which that they were like drawn by hand, like 20 years ago. So, okay. Other things, this is some interesting stuff on the effects of diet on glycogen use. And so this is a weird concept that has kind of lost a little bit of favor. And so what you see here is this is the person's RER. Here is the expected oxidation of carbohydrates, and here's the expected oxidation of fat. And they have what they're calling a fat adapted person. And what they've basically done is they've got two groups. One group is getting fed high levels of carbohydrate. The other group has been getting, is essentially they're on keto or something like that for a while. They're going to call them quote unquote fat adapted. This idea that your metabolism switches in some way to become better at metabolizing fat. It doesn't switch. That's all you're giving it is fat. And so it's like, we're fine, we'll just use the freaking fat. It's okay. And so the thought is that it's somehow that kind of turns on your ability to use fat. And if you get fat adapted, and then you eat some carbs right before your race, and then you go race, that you're already better at using fat. And so you kind of preferentially use some of that, keep your blood glucose, keep your glycogen, and you'll be better at doing your race because you need those carbs at the very end. And there's some evidence that you can sort of switch the way things work. Well, so what you can see is this is over 2 hours, right? This is sort of over 2 hours of the exercise protocol, but it's also sort of day one and then day 6. No, I'm sorry, this is over like 6 months. No. Sorry, they did this for a week. My apologies. I'm confused by my own graphs. So you're getting basically keto for a week or high carbs for a week. RER in the high carb group is higher. So you've got kind of what's happening on your first day, and then on day 6, and then here's over your 2 hours of racing essentially. So RER is higher in the high carb group. I know we're all shocked by that. You eat a bunch of carbs, you metabolize more carbs. RER is lower in the high fat group. Again, you eat a bunch of fat, you metabolize more fat. You look then, shockingly, the things that contribute to RER are going to look that way. So here we look here. This is total substrate oxidation over the course of your 120 minutes. And in the fat adapted people, you will note that they're using more fat over the course of all of this. And the theory then is that this is going on I'm using more fat, therefore I've got some glycogen and some blood glucose left. That should be beneficial. We look at their actual kind of time to complete. At the end, they go for 2 hours and then they do a time trial, basically. At the end of all of that, they're looking at performances, and you see this and you say, maybe it's gone down, but boy, a lot of that's being driven by this one dude here who really got a lot better. I would argue that this is a very outline kind of point. So maybe there's a very small and subtle difference from all of these kinds of things. There's some more evidence, a lot of stuff from Louise Burke and the folks at the Australian Institute of Sport that maybe this is not as kind of hyped up as people thought. But you can certainly change your diet and you can manipulate kind of carbs and fat and glycogen use if you want. So there might be some small effects that we can take advantage of.
That's the train load.
Pardon?
That's the train load.
So you're talking about like from a carb standpoint. Yeah. They also have that for like train low, live high for O2, right? Like you want to like sleep in a O2 deprivation 10 or sleep in an altitude 10, live at sea level so you can train hard. And those kind of things. Yeah, so it's kind of two sides of the same. That's the idea. So train with less, train where you're eating a bunch of fat, and then load up on the carbs, boost your glycogen while also being supposedly better at using fat. I would argue just train more and you'll get more mitochondria and use more freaking fat anyway, but it's a sort of a side thing.
Right, because then train and go hard.
Yeah. Yeah, right, and feel bad. So we'll talk, we won't put at the very end today, we can talk about glycogen loading. So you might ever been to a race, maybe like feed you pasta the night before, or those things. So there's this idea of carbohydrate loading. You just eat a shit ton of carbs and muscle glycogen goes up, which would be good. And it used to be you had to do things and run a bunch and deplete all your glycogen and then eat no carbs for like 3 or 4 days and then eat a bunch of carbs and you get this super spike in your glycogen. We now know you don't even have to do the low part. You just eat a bunch of carbs and you get a bunch of glycogen. So my dad used to do that, and he was a cranky person right before the races because of all that. And you get to eat a bunch of big spike. So that's the classical glycogen loading versus the more kind of nuanced and modern version of glycogen loading. Chris?
But isn't the more modern version where you have to like carbohydrate load over a longer duration instead of just the day before?
So usually it's a couple of days, but there's some evidence that really if you just eat a bunch like for the 2 days before, like you'll get pretty close to the same. I've not looked at the glycogen loading literature in probably 10 years, but you know.
I used to just do it for the day before.
The night before might not be enough, right? You might want to kind of back it out a couple of days.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, here's liver glucose output. So this is breakdown of glycogen in the liver, right? So we've got liver glycogen breakdown as well as some gluconeogenesis, turning sort of proteins and amino acids in there. Glucose levels, they are again exercise time and exercise intensity dependent. And what you can see basically is here's liver glucose output. Here's 40 minutes of exercise. It trickles up a little bit over time, but they're walking, they're jogging, they're brisk jogging. These are pretty fit people if they're doing 85% for half an hour on all of this. But you'll note there's a little bit of a time dependency, but there's a much bigger intensity dependence. And so as the sort of pulling of glucose out of the blood into muscle increases, as exercise time and intensity increases, liver output is going to also increase in a very kind of similar magnitude in an effort to offset and match those things. And so what you can see here is we've got liver glucose output, how much of it is coming from glycogen and how much of it is coming from gluconeogenesis, right? And so here's rest, here's 40 minutes into a bout of exercise, and here's what that's going to be like 4 hours into a bout of exercise. No one wants to participate in this particular trial, but you can see we're 4 hours in, we're trying to get a bunch from the breakdown of amino acids. Okay. So the regulation of this is both neural and hormonal. It also depends upon insulin and glucagon levels, and it really is all about blood glucose. as those two things switch around, right? As you use blood glucose during exercise, glucagon goes up. That's going to stimulate the breakdown in the liver. It's going to drive gluconeogenesis. It's going to drive liver breakdown. Insulin is going up for some reason because you ate something, and it's going to shut these things down. So there's some push-pull. It's going to go on in the midst of all of that. Okay. Next topic, lactate shuttle. Definitely a thing that happens. The extent to which it happens is a matter of debate. Okay? This thing is real and it's very useful. There are some people who shall remain nameless, George Brooks, who think that this is everything. This is the only thing that ever happens, this is the most important thing that happens with metabolism ever. And there are some people that are like, it's cool and it happens and it's important, but it's not quite what this guy thinks. The idea is that lactate is just a carbohydrate. Okay? You make lactic acid, it dissociates, the hydrogen is bad, the lactate's fine. And so what we're going to do then is take said lactate and stick it in the Krebs cycle and break it down and use it for energy. Okay? And so what we see from all of this is that we're going to shuttle or move lactate from fiber to fiber within a muscle, or from sort of the fiber into the blood and then have it taken up by other muscle fibers. Okay? This transport is mediated in most instances by something called monocarboxylate transporters, or MCTs. Two most prominent of these things are MCT1 and MCT4. Okay? And what you can imagine happens is, here's a fast, right? Here's what they're calling a fast glycolytic fiber. This is from George Brooks's book. So this is a 2X fiber here. Break down lots of glycogen, lots of glycolysis. We're making lactate. Okay? That lactate can either stay in this fiber and get put into the Krebs cycle. It can leave this fiber, go into venous blood, go all the way back around through the heart into arterial blood, and get pumped around somewhere where it can get picked up by other muscle fibers. Or it can sort of within that muscle get shuttled over into, say, a type 1 fiber, or a 2X fiber, or another 2A fiber, whatever it's going to be. It can get shuttled over here and then used in those mitochondria, right? The end point of all of this, though, is that generally, whenever you make lactate, its end is going to be back into the Krebs cycle to get broken down. Okay, just like our other things, or you're going to convert it backwards, back into pyruvate, back into, you can kind of back convert most of these kinds of things. The concentrations of these MCT1 and MCT4 shuttle kind of transporters or receptors, however you want to call them, they're going to differ among our fiber types and among muscle tissues. And, some of them are more active than others. The general sense is that we make more lactate in our type 2A and our 2X fibers, and it tends to get taken up more so into our type 1s. Okay? When we talk about lactate threshold, one of the things that helps us determine lactate threshold is your ability to shuttle the lactate that is being made around in the working muscles to get it into the fibers that have better functioning aerobic metabolism, like our slow twitch, or to get it out into the blood and then get it taken up into other tissue. Tissue that is either also contracting or tissue that's not contracting. If you can get it into other tissues, then it doesn't stay in the blood long enough for us to be able to measure it. We're going to call that lactate clearance, and that will help you to work at higher rates and keep your blood lactate at the same or sort of reduced levels compared to what it was before.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
So if it can be transferred from different tissues to different tissues, could it go from skeletal muscle to cardiac muscle?
I'm sorry, skeletal muscle, did you say regular muscle?
Cardiac.
Cardiac muscle. I don't know the answer to that question, Chris.
Okay.
My assumption is yes. but I don't know that for certain. I mean, if it ends up in coronary circulation, I don't see why it wouldn't
Yeah.
in that particular way. So in a similar way that when you have a heart attack, right, you've probably made a lot of lactate from your cardiac muscle. And my sense is that's going to get into circulation and get taken up by skeletal muscle. So my guess is yes, but I don't know for certain.
Okay.
Good question. Okay. So here's an intracellular lactate shuttle. Okay. We've got LDH enzymes here in our mitochondria, which I know seems backwards, right? That sort of seems backwards. But we've got pyruvate, we've made some lactate, and then we have a pyruvate, we have an MCT on the mitochondria. And so this was kind of a big, profound thing that we think, oh, we're going to do this. And sometimes we take the pyruvate, we make lactic acid, we make that lactate, we dump the lactate into the mitochondria, and then we turn it back into pyruvate. We're going to borrow, right? We're going to do this, and then we're going to sort of remake some of our NADH, and now we've got pyruvate that can go into Krebs, and we've got some electrons that go here. And so there's also going to be some, not just shuttling from fiber to fiber or from tissue to tissue, but also some shuttling within that particular muscle cell.
So lactate cannot be oxidized directly.
I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that yet. I would have said yes, that it can be oxidized directly. I mean, if it has a carbon on it, it can be oxidized. Like that's, but in this, the way they're showing it here, it's going to pyruvate. So I would need to read a little bit more on all of this to try to understand. My assumption or my impression from things that I have read and seen is that the lactate itself. So when you have cells, they just run on lactate. That's all they do. So I'll see if I can look that up. We'll try to figure that out. Okay. Do we do the 5-minute tour of fat oxidation, or do we save fat oxidation for the next day? Thoughts? Sorry, Matt? Save it? Okay, we'll save it for Wednesday. So we'll do this. We'll do our critical thinking questions on Wednesday. I'm sure we're behind by like 2 weeks, but that's okay.